Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to another edition of Race to the Finish Line Battleground America 2020 election. I'm Marty Coates, your host, and I'm excited to be back with you now. Just about 1 week, 1 week away from the big election, the general election of November the 3rd. So much has happened across these last 3.5 years, and certainly across the last 12 months as we inch closer and closer to decisions at certainly the national level, but also the state and local level as well. My guest today is one that I'm so excited to have you meet and to visit with us for just a few minutes. He has an extensive background in the policy side of government, but also in politics. We've known each other for most of our lives, and certainly he is going to be one that's going to be a very interesting person to talk to as we bring him in the screen with us here. Ray Starling. Ray, welcome to the program today.
Thank you, Marty. And you didn't tell them that you were a mentor of mine as I was coming through FFA, 2 or 3. We won't count how many decades. Yeah, already.
Well, wait a minute, not three decades. Hold on.
Could be. It's close. It may be closer to 3 than 2.
Well, let's see. I did the math last night. I think I'm about 15 years ahead of you. So.
Oh, I don't know.
But I do appreciate you taking time. You know, I've watched your careers. You've come along since you're, like you said, a teenager, making your way through FFA with great admiration, and not surprised at all that you find yourself where you find yourself today now as general counsel for the North Carolina Chamber after a really extensive career both in state and national level politics. And I think it would be, you could tell us better than anything I could say, but I'm obviously very proud of the work you've done there with the Department of Agriculture in North Carolina. You went on to work with Senator Tillis when he was Speaker, and then went on to Washington and spent some time there. And then your last post, of course, was in the White House as a senior advisor to the president on agricultural issues. But your background is agriculture. You grew up there on a farm. You went to NC State, our alma mater. You got a degree in ag ed, and from there went on to that other school over in Orange County, somewhere over there, and Chatham County, wherever it is. I don't even like to talk about. My car won't even stop in that town. It keeps going back. And got your law degree, but we're really proud of what you've done since you left college. Tell us a little bit, if you would, Ray, about your move from. Sure. I guess from law school into your early jobs, and then take us up through, I guess, your most recent, your last post there in the White House.
Yeah, well, it's a long and winding path, but it actually starts with FFA. I mean, when I had a chance to do what you did a few years earlier, when I had a chance to be a national FFA officer, one of the things I observed out on the road, and for those of you that aren't familiar with what that experience is like, you literally take a year out of your higher education. You basically quit college for a year and serve FFA, and they put you on the road. They put you out in the States. They send you on some international trips to gain some perspective. All through those conversations, and in particular in conversations with agricultural business leaders, what I consistently heard was, we're going to get the technical side of agriculture right. That's the jacket I had on when I came to some of these realizations. We're going to understand how it is that we can make that corn grow more bushels per acre. We're going to get more efficiency out of that water going into that animal or into that crop. But the challenges we're going to have in agriculture are going to largely be around, how does agriculture interact with society? What do people think about the way our food is raised? What do people think about the way we treat animals, or about the way we treat the earth? And of course, we have very strong feelings about that in agriculture. We feel like we do a good job with that, but a lot of people are asking questions. And what I understood even 20 some years ago was, we had that talent on the technical side. We had the chemist and the botanist and the agronomist that were developing a better and better agriculture. But that was going to be impeded if we didn't also have conversations in the public policy realm, and frankly, in the social realm. And that's even more true today. We can probably talk about that some later, but think about the way people talk about agriculture in social media and in social context today. So it's even a bigger challenge today, I think, than it was 20 years ago. And so I knew, Marty, that I wanted to be in that sphere. I mean, I wanted to be at the negotiating table. I wanted to be in the hall of the legislature. I wanted to be in the courtroom. And the way for me to do that was not to go back home and farm, not to go back home and teach ag ed, which I was really looking forward to do, and have such an admiration for those people that do that, all teaching. In fact, I'm married to a teacher. But with that said, my calling was to go in this public policy space. So when I finished law school, I clerked for Supreme Court Justice here in North Carolina. I went to work at an international law firm, wouldn't take anything for that experience because it really taught me how to be a lawyer. But then the phone rang and it was Commissioner Agriculture, Steve Troxler, who's elected statewide in North Carolina, both North and South Carolina, elect their commissioners. And I had a chance to go be the general counsel at the State Department of Ag. And what I consistently thought when I made this move was, I'm going to come back years later into the private practice, and I'm just going to use this experience to kind of learn the subject matter and get to know more people. Well, I was at the Department of Ag for a few years. That put me on the radar of the legislature. Eventually had the chance to go be the general counsel and the ag advisor for the Speaker of the House. You don't say no to that. Then that guy, Thom Tillis, decided he was going to run for Senate. He wasn't supposed to win. He ended up winning. And I said, well, maybe I'll tag along with you up to Washington for a couple of years. And he said, come on, we'll put up with you. And I went to D.C. I ended up becoming his chief of staff about a year in. And then about a year after that, the phone rang and I had a chance to go work in the White House and subsequently over at the U.S. Department of Agriculture as Secretary Perdue's chief of staff over there. And so the common denominator in all of that was an interest in ag policy and a desire to be a part of those conversations that are shaping agriculture and food. If ag doesn't sound exciting, then food certainly does. And that's kind of what the story of the career has been. And then I've now ended up at the statewide Chamber of Commerce, where we've things with the food side and making sure those two things are talking and working together. And then the last thing, and I'll yield back to you, Marty, is what we've seen in recent years is threats to our food system, not through the legislative realm, but through the legal realm, through courtrooms, through lawyers, through lawsuits. And so I run something at the chamber called the Chamber Legal Institute. And the idea there is that we would exert that same policy influence, that same voice in the judicial branch that we do over in the legislative branch. So that's kind of the common thread through it all, through the years, is the ag policy and the ag industry.
Well, it's not surprising to me at all that your path would go the way that it's gone. One of the interesting things that I find that would be another thread for your career, and shed some light on this, your work in Washington when you actually made that decision to go over to the White House and serve as a senior advisor for ag issues to the president. Sure. What was that like? I mean, of course, I've had a chance to visit with you when we were there in Washington. You were so gracious to have us here at your office. And but what was it like to work inside the bubble, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. First of all, let me, in full disclosure, I mean, it was the Trump White House. So to pretend that it was not different would, I think, be disingenuous. I mean, Trump ran as an outsider. He has governed as an outsider. He is running again still as an outsider. And so there were a lot of traditional processes that were different in his White House. I did get to brief the president several times, particularly, of course, on agricultural issues. I never had an encounter where the president was not sincere, did not ask great questions, and where we didn't have, frankly, good input and feel like he was listening to what his advisors were suggesting that he focus on. So in terms of the relationship directly with the president, of course, that's unreal. I mean, the first time you walk in the Oval Office and you realize you're not there as a tourist, it is actually your job to talk to the president of the United States, not knowing what questions he may ask you ahead of time. That's, of course, a daunting task, but one that, you sort of grow into. You sort of have to step into those shoes, if you will. Beyond just that little piece of talking directly with the president, you have all the pomp and circumstance of the White House, right? I mean, there's all the security. I never got tired of that. I always thought it was kind of neat. The Iron Gate, nothing like pulling up to that Iron Gate and it going down and you getting to drive into the White House complex. I mean, that's obviously a privilege and something that you should take seriously, and I did. The other thing I would add is the thing that surprised me was how many checks and balances there were. Generally speaking, you don't just bebop into the Oval Office and have a conversation with the president. There's a whole process that has to occur for you to get time on the president's schedule. Now, again, be misleading if I didn't tell you that process, I think, is a little looser with this president than perhaps it has been with some others. I don't know that to be the case, but, I think his style is a little more ebb and flow than it is, very, very dictated, if you will. And then I think the last thing about working at the White House is it is its own community. I mean, it's kind of like going back to a small high school. You eat with your colleagues. I mean, you really don't leave the complex much because of the need to come in and out of security. There's a cafeteria in the bottom of the West Wing that if you're at a certain rank, you have an opportunity to eat there. Unfortunately, I was a part of that group. There's a little place down in the bottom of the old executive office building they call Ike's. And it's a little takeout place, just a little sandwich place. But you're working really long hours with really smart people. Everybody's on the same team, and there is a sense of community there. And certainly that was true when I was there. I can't speak, of course, to today. I'm sure it's a very different place in political season. But it wouldn't take anything for that experience. Probably the most rewarding thing, Marty, was my daughter actually got to come to work with me a couple of days at the White House, and that she still talks about those days and the people she met. I remember going in through security, and one of the cabinet secretaries was coming out, and I said, "Do you mind?" I think it was Rick Perry or somebody, and I said, "Do you mind if I get a picture with my daughter?" And of course, that was pre-COVID, when you could hug a little kid and take a cute picture, and those are good memories. So it was personally rewarding, and I will say this will be the last thing I'll say about that. It was absolutely a chance to move the needle. I mean, having a few conversations, even sometimes that didn't rise to the level of the president. There were certain decisions that were made elsewhere throughout the White House that really had an impact on budgeting, had an impact on policy, and that's a grave responsibility. I mean, it was an amazing place to be.
But without question, you did have an impact because the president was not agriculture wasn't something that he would be well indoctrinated on, and he's leaned very heavily on the advice he's gotten from his counsel like you. And of course, we've seen across the last 12 to 18 months the trade deals, the impact of China with our agricultural commodities. Our farmers have been pushed back and forth and around, and it certainly appears that the president's been listening to his advisors on how to make the negotiations necessary to benefit the farmers. Would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think the thing that the president got that so many other people that try to understand farmers don't, there's sort of this technical understanding of what farmers do. Most people try to wrap their head around that and get that, and they ignore the emotional side of farming and the challenges and the entrepreneurialism that has to be present if you're going to be willing to go out every year and borrow money to put seed in the ground. The president got that side arguably better than anybody I had worked with. He immediately realized these people, notwithstanding me coming from New York and being more of a real estate guy, these people understand risk and embrace it. And so that was rewarding to see. I think that's one reason they've sort of rallied around him. They know that even if his policies haven't 100% helped them, even though they're genuine, then they do in fact know they're genuine, that he does have their best interest at heart. With regard to the trade deal stuff, great point, great question. And who knows what we'll have next? If the president remains there, we'll see how these deals he struck end up working out. If he's not there, we'll see what parts of these deals end up getting taken back off the table. But I think what the president believes in is, hey, if we're going to have free trade, let's have free trade. And what he was willing to say was the last 20 or 25 years, we've all talked about free trade. But at the end of the day, when we can get our chain jerked by some of these other countries the way they can, that's not really free trade. And so I think sort of pointing that out, while it certainly did create some market turbulence over time, I think he was onto something there. And I think, frankly, farmers understood that for the most part.
And Ray, of course, you have great credibility with those that look to you for advice. The Secretary of Agriculture, the Senator before he.
I usually try to say this in some of my introductory remarks. For all the experiences I've had, for all the honors I've gotten to do job wise, and for all the hard lessons I've learned, frankly, coming into adulthood, none of them compare or as important as the things I learned growing up on the family farm. And I don't just say that. I know it's very typical for people to talk about growing up on the farm and hard work and what they learned. But there were some really lasting impressions that came out of that experience. Very diversified farm. I worked in tobacco a lot of hand intensive agriculture. We also had a hog farm. We are still farming hogs, but it is tiny. It's an independent operation. It's not like most of the way we raise hogs, not just in North Carolina, but across the country. And now the operation has become even more diverse. They're doing more fruits and vegetables, doing more roadside stand, direct retail type stuff. But when I was growing up, it was all about pigs and tobacco. And one was sticky and one didn't smell good. And I'd let you figure out which.
Well, you spoke earlier about the difference in our ages, and of course, one of my best friends was your teacher. I think as you came along, Glenn Howell and Marshall Stewart and that whole era. Those guys were of my era. But you may remember. I know your parents would, but you may remember. Do you remember the farm market reports that would be called out on the radio every day? Pink Hill, Pine Hill, Spivey's Corner.
The way he rolled off that Roland, going down through the list, I totally remember that.
Pine Level, Pink Hill. Yeah, it was. I'd love to hear. It was almost like an auctioneer's chant.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But those
now a lot of the markets aren't there anymore, right?
No, those markets are gone. I think every now and then I see a public market of some sort where folks are coming in, but not like we knew in the old days. Of course, everything's gone to contracts and bigger operations. Let's shift gears just a little bit, Ray. We talked about policy for the most part so far, but I want to shift gears a little bit. You can't be involved in government where you were, even at the policy level, and not have a feel for or your finger on the pulse of the bosses you work for. They were all elected officials. So the bosses you work for all had to be concerned every time an election year rolled around. How do you see what's going on right now? We're 6-7 days out, 63 million votes already in the box. It's just unprecedented. This election in North Carolina and the national level, give me some insights as to where you see things today. We're, again, 7 days out.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's worth commenting on, and all of your viewers and you will agree with this, politics, particularly here in North Carolina, but across the country, there's not a state's politics anymore that is not also national politics. And by that, I mean, and let's take the North Carolina example, we have probably the number one most competitive Senate race in the country at the moment. And perhaps, in fact, we think this is true, that who wins the North Carolina seat will control the United States Senate, not that individual, but their party. And so if Thom Tillis were to lose, it's quite likely that the balance of power in the United States Senate would flip, and Chuck Schumer would be the majority leader. Whereas if Cunningham, if Tillis were to win, then of course Mitch McConnell would keep the majority leader's gavel. And so this nationalization of even state level politics has had a couple of impacts. One of them is money being spent on the ground. And I looked at this just before we got on the show, Marty, and in the presidential race, I'll come back to the presidential figures, but let's talk about that U.S. Senate figure. We can document, and there's a lot of money that we won't be able to document until the elections are over and all the reporting is done. But we can document as of today about $175 million being spent in one state, in North Carolina, over one Senate seat. $175 million. We actually think when all is told at the end of the day, at the end of next week, if you will, that number will be close to $250 million. So that nationalization of politics really has had an impact on our state level politics and on how we select representatives, senators, leaders, governors, et cetera here. Obviously, the second thing that's really on my mind right now is this is the COVID election. It's changed everything. I mean, obviously, it's changed people's impressions of particular politicians, how they've handled the crisis they are being judged on, no doubt about that. But the very fact that you brought up, the fact that such a large percentage of Americans have already voted, that would not have been the case without some sort of shock to the system like COVID. And so particularly for certain age groups, the presidents, the governors, the senators, the state legislatures handling of the COVID crisis is dictating what happens on the ballot. And then you almost see this really neat dichotomy in terms of how the two parties have decided to discuss it. And each have kind of gone to their base issue. You consistently see Democrats talking about how COVID-19 is a health crisis, and they are generally perceived. I mean, if you look at polls and you ask, who do you trust more on healthcare issues, a generic Republican or a generic Democrat? Frequently, the generic Democrat ballot wins out, not by a lot, but by some. On the other hand, if you ask about economics, who do you trust more with the economy? Who do you believe has the better ideas about growing our economic situation? you'll see that typically trend toward Republicans. Again, not all the time, and the differences aren't extraordinarily stark. But what we've seen in the wake of COVID is Republicans have gone to this economic message that this is in addition to being a health crisis, it is an economic crisis, and we have to think about it that way and prepare for it and respond to it that way. And Democrats have gone more to the healthcare side, again, acknowledging that it has economic consequences and that some of those are borne on folks who are already disadvantaged coming into the crisis. But I think you've seen the sides, frankly, play to their bases and play to their strengths. That's not accidental. Similarly, you would expect a conservative to generally be less willing to embrace government mandates over how we deal with COVID. And that's exactly what we've seen. You've frequently seen Republicans push back against some of the shutdown mechanisms. On the flip side, you would expect a more progressive voter to say, hey, I'm okay with that. I want government to make those decisions. I don't just want guidelines. I actually want government to come in and create a mandate there. And so both sides are playing to their base. I think that's why it's going to end up being so close. And I think that's why it's COVID at the presidential level, either healthcare or the economy. So when I say COVID, I mean either one of those things at the national level, at the congressional level, and even at the statewide level here in North Carolina.
Well, and this year in North Carolina, you mentioned, of course, the Tillis and Cunningham race being so contentious and upfront and so potentially monumental in terms of how the Senate might flip. We have a similar race in South Carolina between Jamie Harrison and Senator Graham. Again, very, very tight race. At the state level in North Carolina, rumblings are that there's, some really challenging races happening in the Senate. The House is probably going to maintain its position with a Republican majority. How do you see the Senate there in North Carolina? Is it really as tight as some of the prognosticators are suggesting?
Yeah. No, I think the hard part of answering that question is we're just not sure. But I mean, certainly in polling that we've looked at, polling that we've done at the NC Chamber, it is absolutely tight. And one of the reasons it's tight is there again, let's talk about the money. And the only numbers I have for the state House and state Senate seats, these are, of course, the people that come and serve in the General Assembly in Raleigh. They're actually combined with the Council of State, which are people like Commissioner Troxler, the Commissioner of Insurance, the Superintendent of Public Instruction. In those races, we've never seen the amount of investment that we're seeing this cycle, over $50 million in those races. And so when there's that much money sloshing around, frankly, both sides are going to be smart about where they spend it, and they're going to be strategic. And they're going to go after races that are 1 and 2 point races that they think they can flip. And so I think the one observation I have about the state Senate, I'm perhaps a little less I believe it's less likely that chamber will flip than perhaps you do. But that's because we have seen Trump at the top of the ticket improve his standing in the state over the last couple of weeks. Now, don't ask me to explain that. What I can tell you is that in the polling, he has pretty much pulled even with Vice President Biden. Now, and particularly if there is an undercount of people who aren't comfortable telling a pollster that they're going to vote for Trump, or if there's just mischief, someone saying they're going to vote one way, even though they're going to really vote another way. And frankly, that could be happening on both sides. It has always happened on both sides, but it is generally balanced out or canceled out. If that's different and Trump wins by even more than he may potentially, then I think one of the advantages you have to think about with the state House and the state Senate is districting, right? Because Trump may do very well in a rural part of the state where Republicans are trying to defend a state Senate seat, even though he may get hammered in Wake County. Well, that's just, the way districts work, right? If Trump has a 10% win in a district where there's a competitive state Senate race, that is obviously going to help the Republican in that state Senate race. And so I'm a little less convinced that there'll be a flip. Partly though, let's disclose my colors. I'm a registered Republican and I've worked for Republican. We need folks on both sides to be thoughtful and engage in conversation, and we have some of that. We're very fortunate to have some of that in North Carolina. And so with that said, I think that, at the end of the day, it's not just going to come out to turnout. That's what you hear all the talking heads say, right, Marty? It's,
Right,
oh,
that's
it's
right.
a turnout election. What I say back to that is, you ever seen an election that was not a turnout election? They're all turnout.
That's right.
But I think it means different things statewide than it means district by district. So, Trump could lose the statewide vote by 50 to 100,000 votes, but still do well enough in some of these rural, sort of traditionally red counties, so that state House members and state Senate members get to come back if they're Republican.
Well, let me just throw a couple of things in there for you, real quick observations. Traditionally, or across many years, the Triad area, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, that I-40, I-85 corridor has really been the deciding factor in a lot of those statewide and even national races. There seems to be a push away that's maybe some of those races are not nearly as tight anymore, but some of the ones down in Cumberland County, for example, a couple of races in the more rural areas of Robinson County, up in the northeastern part of Dare County, there's a real exciting Senate and a House race going on there. Those areas tend to be influenced, I believe, as you said, very heavily by how well the president does. Your gubernatorial race, your lieutenant governor race, all hinging most likely, wouldn't you suggest, on just how well the president does? If he pulls out 2 to 3 points, it's really going to make a difference in a lot of those races.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The one exception to that, if I'm just being completely transparent and trying to be straightforward, is I do think, at least if you can believe the polls, and we've already asterisked that earlier in our conversation, but for whatever reason, it looks like Governor Cooper, has had an easier time in his reelection in the fight against Dan Forest. A couple of things I would say come out of that race kind of draw my attention. One of them is, obviously, Cooper is better funded.
Yes.
There's no question that he's basically got $2 to every one of Lieutenant Governor Forrest's $1. So that's obviously an advantage. And then second, of course, Cooper has really been in the news with his management of COVID. And although there may be disagreements about whether he has done it right, in other words, whether the policies he's adopted have in fact been the right ones for our state, there's certainly some room to quibble about that. But I don't think he's made any big mistakes. Right. And so that's helped him, particularly if you go back to what I said earlier about the fact that it's the COVID election. And so I think that's the one exception. Otherwise, I think you're exactly right. I think the top of the ticket matters. It's going to matter all the way down the ballot, even for some local elections for school boards, county commissioners, and things of that nature.
Well, in my time in politics, I spent some time in the legislature myself here in South Carolina, and the most exciting time of any election is right now. For the candidate, for his team, for her team, it's these last 5 or 6 days when everybody thinks it's almost done. It's just when that group's got to keep working. So I think you're right. There's still a lot of momentum out there to be dealt with, and all of these races are still very, very active and alive. Ray, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you carving out 30 minutes. I've seen your Google Calendar, and getting 30 minutes today was pretty incredible, and I appreciate you doing that. I don't want us to leave without us just closing. Today at 11 o'clock this morning, I think it was 11 o'clock this morning, the 93rd FFA National Convention kicked off. You alluded to it as you made your opening remarks about our relationship in that organization. When I was coming along, it was in November. Now it's in that last week of October. It's all being done virtually this year. So there again, a COVID impact on a tremendous tradition for those of us that love agriculture. And it's an honor to have you on the program. I think I did the math. There's probably only about 540 or so of us that have shared the national officer ring.
Sure.
And among all of them, I know those of us that have served, we look upon you with great admiration and look forward to what your future holds going forward. I know right now your mind's on your work there with the chamber, and thank you for doing that. But certainly we're going to be thinking about how the future will look for Ray Starling.
What I say when people bring that kind of stuff up is, Marty, I say, I'm going to prove to you I'm smarter than you think I am. I might be done with my public service. Not outright.
Well, I don't know. That may be true, but I'll simply say this: you've been a real help to the state, and you're going to continue doing that there with the chamber. Thanks for being with us, Ray. God bless you.
Marty, God bless you. I appreciate the time. Always good to see you, friend.
Good to see you. Ray Starling, General Counsel for the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce, and my friend. Now, I showed you his picture. He said I was about 2 decades ahead of him. I'm going to throw my picture in. His was in color. Mine was in black and white. That doesn't mean it was taken in the 40s, however. About 15 years or so difference in our times of service. Folks, thanks again for being with us on this week's edition of today's edition of Race to the Finish Line, Battleground America. We'll be back on Thursday. Excited to have 9th District Congressman Dan Bishop from North Carolina will be our guest on Thursday. Join us Thursday morning at 11 o'clock here on Facebook Live at Race to the Finish Line, Battleground America. See you on Thursday.